A tomb on the island of Crete sits undisturbed for over 3,000 years, sealed since the last days of a civilization that left behind palaces, frescoes, and a written script nobody on Earth can read. A few hundred miles north, the bones of the people who supposedly built the foundation of Western civilization wait in a lab freezer in Boston. Somewhere between those two places, a number is about to surface that no textbook prepared you for. And when scientists finally crack open the genetic code hidden inside both sets of remains, the story they expected to confirm falls apart completely. The people history calls the first Greeks may not be where the trail begins at all. Something moved across the Aegean thousands of years before Athens, before Sparta, before a single myth was ever told. And it left fingerprints in DNA that nobody thought to look for until now. By the end of this, you will understand why the label on one of the most famous civilizations in human history might be pointing at the wrong starting line entirely. This is not a fringe theory circulating on some forum. This comes from one of the most rigorous ancient DNA studies ever conducted on the Aegean World, led by Dr. Josef Lazaridis of Harvard Medical School, working alongside David Reich, one of the most cited population geneticists alive, and Johannes Krauss of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Their findings, published in the journal Nature, pulled genome-wide data from 19 ancient individuals recovered from Crete and most mainland Greece, including the very people who built the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds. The samples were originally collected by George Stamatoianopoulos, a physician-scientist at the University of Washington, working with archaeologists on the ground, before Krauss's lab carried out the genomic sequencing itself. This is peer-reviewed, published, institutionally verified science. And what it found rewrites a story that has stood for over a century. Think of DNA the way you'd think of layers of paint on a very old house. Every renovation, every family that ever lived there, leaves a new coat behind. And if you know how to strip each layer back carefully, you can see exactly who painted what and when. That's essentially what geneticists do with an ancient genome. They are not reading a diary. They are reading paint layers, laid down by thousands of years of migration. And each layer tells you where the people who added it actually came from. When Lazaridis and his team stripped back the layers on Minoan and Mycenaean skeletons, the paint underneath did not match the story anyone expected. To understand why that matters, you have to go back even further than Crete or Mycenae, back to a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey. Archaeologists working at a site called Göbekli Tepe uncovered massive carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures built by hunter-gatherers roughly 11,000 years ago, before pottery, before writing, before anyone anywhere had planted a single deliberate crop. It sits inside a stretch of land most archaeologists already point to as the place where humans first domesticated wheat, barley, and lentils, and first began settling down instead of following herds. UNESCO now lists the site as a World Heritage Landmark precisely because of what it represents, one of the earliest known turning points where humanity stopped wandering and started building. This is the same broader Anatolian landscape that, thousands of years later, sent farming populations pouring outward into Europe. The Minoans and Mycenaeans were, genetically speaking, descendants of that outward migration. The line does not run in a single neat path from Göbekli Tepe to Knossos, but the region itself keeps surfacing at the root of civilization's earliest chapters, long before Greece existed as a concept at all. Here's where the legitimacy of this actually gets tested against the myth. For over 100 years since the British archaeologist Arthur Evans first excavated the palace at Knossos in 1900, the Minoans were treated as this almost mysterious, semi-isolated culture unique to Crete. Evans himself was so struck by the elaborate frescoes, the plumbing systems, and the maze-like architecture that he named the civilization after the legendary King Minoan openly speculated that its people might have roots in Egypt or the Near East, based purely on the visual style of their art and their hieroglyphic-looking script. For decades, that speculation sat there unresolved because there was no way to actually test it. Bones don't come with a passport. It took modern ancient DNA, sequencing, more than a century later, to finally answer the question Evans could only guess at. Between 62 and 86% of Minoan and Mycenaean ancestry traces back to farmers who migrated out of Anatolia, the region that is now modern Turkey, beginning roughly 9,000 years ago as agriculture itself spread into Europe. These were not people who sprang up locally on Crete or the Greek mainland in isolation. They were descendants of a much older migration wave that brought farming, and with it, the population base for everything that followed, out of the Near East and into the Aegean centuries before anyone had ever heard the word Greek. That number is the single biggest reveal in this entire story, so it's worth sitting with for a second. 62 to 86% of the ancestry behind two of history's most celebrated civilizations did not originate where those civilizations were built. It originated somewhere else entirely, carried there by people who never called themselves Minoan or Mycenaean, who were simply farmers moving west in search of better land. 86%. That is not a footnote in someone's genome. That is most of the genetic identity of an entire civilization traced back to a different landmass. But the Anatolian farmers are only the first layer of paint. Underneath that, the researchers found something else. Ancestry tied to populations from the Caucasus Mountains and from ancient Iran, threading through both the Minoan and Mycenaean genomes. This wasn't a small trace. It suggested an additional wave of movement, one that funneled people from the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian into the eastern Mediterranean world, well before the Bronze Age cities we associate with early Greek civilization were ever built. Here's the part that gets interesting. Where the Minoans and Mycenaeans start to look genetically similar, they are not identical, and the difference between them turns out to matter enormously for how we understand who actually shaped what would become Greece. Now let's get into what separates the two. The Mycenaeans, the mainland culture famous for its warrior imagery, its shaft graves loaded with gold, and its later association with the legends of Troy, carried something the Minoans did not. Additional ancestry connected to populations from the Eurasian steppe, or from the region around Armenia, arriving by way of Eastern Europe. According to Lazaridis, this points to a second wave of migration that reached mainland Greece but never made it across the water to Crete. The Minoans stayed genetically closer to that original Anatolian farming population. The Mycenaeans picked up something extra on the way, two civilizations sharing a deep common root, but diverging based on which later migrations reached them and which didn't. And this is where the genetics and the archaeology actually confirm each other rather than one simply overriding the other. Visually, Minoans and Mycenaeans looked strikingly alike in their own art, both cultures painting dark-haired, dark-eyed figures on frescoes and pottery, and the genetic data backs that up directly, showing both as dominated by nature scenes, dolphins, saffron gatherers, ritual dancers, with almost no depictions of warfare. Mycenaean art leans hard into spears, armor, by geography, contact, and time. That's triangulation working exactly the way it should, genetics and material culture independently pointing at the same underlying picture. There's one more layer worth pulling out before we move on, because it comes from a completely different part of the genome, and it confirms the same story from an entirely separate angle. Alongside the broad, genome-wide ancestry data, the researchers also examined Y chromosome lineages, the genetic material passed strictly from father to with the broader ancestry findings, reinforcing the same Anatolian-rooted, eastward-connected picture rather than contradicting it. In population genetics, when two independent lines of evidence, the whole genome data and the Y chromosome data, converge on the same conclusion, that's about as close to confirmation as this kind of research gets. It's the equivalent of two separate witnesses, questioned separately, describing the same event the same way. Let's pause and restack what we've uncovered so far, because there's a lot moving here. Layer 1, Anatolian farmers, arriving thousands of years before the Bronze Age, forming the genetic bedrock of both Crete and mainland Greece. Layer 2, an eastern current from the Caucasus and Iran, threading into that same bedrock. Layer 3, a steppe-linked wave that reached the Mycenaeans on the mainland but stopped short of the island. 3 separate migratory currents converging in one place, producing what history would later package as a single, self-contained birthplace of Western civilization. It was never that simple. And we're only getting started, because the next question is the one that actually matters for you, sitting here in the present. If ancient Minoans and Mycenaeans carried this layered migrant ancestry, what does that mean for the millions of people living in Greece today who trace their identity back to that same soil? This is where the study connects the ancient world directly to the modern one. The researchers compared their ancient genomes against more than 2,600 present-day genomes from populations around the world, including contemporary Greek samples from Thessaloniki, Thessaly, and central Greece. The result? Modern Greeks share the overwhelming majority of their genetic ancestry with the Bronze Age Mycenaeans specifically, somewhere in the range of 70 to 80% overlap. In the next part of this, we get into why that number is even more remarkable than it first sounds. 3,200 years separate a Mycenaean warrior from a person walking through Athens today. In that span, Greece was folded into the Roman Empire, absorbed into the Byzantine world, touched by Slavic migrations in the early medieval period, and ruled for centuries under the Ottomans. Empires rose, collapsed, and rebuilt themselves on that same land, and populations moved in and out with every shift in power. And yet the core genetic signature traced back to the Mycenaeans survived through all of it, diluted slightly but never erased. That is not what most population geneticists would have predicted going in. Continuous upheaval usually means continuous genetic turnover. Greece, remarkably, kept its Bronze Age foundation largely intact underneath, everything layered on top of it later. To get that answer, the team didn't just compare a handful of samples. They ran the ancient genomes against more than 330 other ancient genetic profiles from across Europe and the Near East, and against roughly 2,600 present-day genomes pulled from populations worldwide, cross-referencing 1.2 million individual points of genetic code in each comparison. That scale is what allows a finding like 70 to 80% continuity to actually hold up under scrutiny. It isn't one lucky match. It's a pattern that repeats across sample after sample, region after region, confirmed independently by multiple research groups working from different genetic datasets. When a result survives that many independent checks, it stops being a hypothesis and starts being one of the more settled findings in the field of ancient DNA. As Lazaretus himself put it, describing the pattern his team uncovered, the Greek population has always been something of a work in progress, with new layers of migration adding onto the story across the centuries without ever fully erasing what came before. That single idea reframes the entire question this video opened with. Western civilization did not begin fully formed on Greek soil, sealed off from the rest of the world. It began as a convergence, Anatolian farmers meeting Caucasus and Iranian-linked populations, and slowly becoming what the ancient world would eventually call Greek. The DNA does not erase Greek identity. It reveals the ingredients that built it, ingredients drawn from 3 separate directions on the map, long before Homer, long before the Parthenon, long before anyone wrote the word democracy down. If a single reveal in ice, this story deserves your attention more than any other, it's that one, so hit like right now if that reframes anything for you. And let's get into what this doesn't prove, because that part matters just as much as what it does. Zoom out one more level, and the pattern gets even bigger than Greece alone. The same broad Anatolian and Near Eastern migration wave that seeded the Minoan and Mycenaean gene pool also shows up, in different proportions, across ancient genomes recovered from Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, and even the British Isles, carried outward by the same Neolithic farming expansion that started in the Fertile Crescent. Stonehenge itself was raised by descendants of farming populations whose ancestry traces back toward that same general region of the ancient Near East. That doesn't mean one single group built everything from Anatolia to England. It means the transition into farming, and the mass movement of people that came with it, radiated outward from roughly the same corner of the map again and again in wave after wave for thousands of years before anyone in that story had a name for Greece, Rome, or Britain at all. What you're looking at when you stack Göbekli Tepe against Knossos against Mycenae is not a single line of descent. It's the same regional starting point appearing again and again underneath civilizations that would later be taught in isolation from one another, as though they'd sprung up independently with no shared root at all. This is where the honesty has to take over from the momentum. What this research does not do is erase or replace Greek civilization's own achievements, its language, its philosophy, its political innovations, or its cultural identity as it developed on its own terms, once these populations settled into the Aegean. Ancestry is not the same thing as culture, and DNA cannot tell you who invented democracy, who wrote the Iliad, or who first staged a tragedy in an amphitheater. Those innovations happened on Greek soil, among Greek-speaking people, regardless of where their ancestors originated generations earlier. It's also worth being precise about what the genetic data can and cannot claim at the individual level. These 19 genomes represent specific burials from specific sites, not a complete census of every person who ever lived in the Minoan or Mycenaean world. Population-level ancestry percentages describe broad genetic trends across a sample. They are not proof about any single unnamed individual's exact lineage, and researchers are careful not to overstate that distinction. The Minoan language, Linear A, also remains undeciphered to this day, meaning we still cannot directly read what the Minoans said about their own origins in their own words. The genetics fill-in-a-picture archaeology alone could never provide, but plenty of open questions remain, including the precise timing and mechanism of that steppe-linked migration onto the mainland, something Lazaretus' team flagged as a target for future research rather than a settled fact. Nobody involved in this research is claiming that Greek civilization is somehow not Greek, or that its cultural achievements belong to some other older population. Ancestry and identity are not interchangeable ideas, and conflating them is exactly the kind of overreach real geneticists working in this field actively try to avoid. What the data shows is narrower and, honestly, more interesting than a headline claiming Greek civilization was secretly built by outsiders. It shows that identity itself is layered, built the same way the genome is built, through convergence rather than isolation. And that applies to essentially every population on Earth once you go back far enough. So bring it back to that sealed tomb on Crete and that freezer in a Boston laboratory. Neither one holds the story of an isolated people who simply appeared on Greek soil and built a civilization in a vacuum. They hold the story of farmers who walked out of Anatolia 9,000 years ago joined by travelers from the Caucasus and Iran, joined again by a wave moving down from the Eurasian steppe, all of it converging on a handful of islands and a mainland peninsula until something entirely new took shape there. What emerged was not imported wholesale from anywhere else. It was built on that ground by those people over centuries, but the ground itself was never as isolated as the myth made it sound. Western civilization's supposed birthplace turns out to be less a single point of origin and more a meeting point, a place where different currents of ancient humanity converged long enough to become something the rest of history would remember by one name. Somewhere, that sealed tomb on Crete is still sealed, and there are more of them out there, waiting for the next team with the right equipment and the right questions. Every one of them holds another paint layer, another piece of a migration story that started long before anyone thought to write it down. The label stays the same. Greek civilization is still Greek civilization, built by Greek-speaking people on Greek soil through their own ingenuity over their own centuries. But the roots underneath that label now reach further than anyone assumed a decade ago, out past the Aegean, out past the mainland, back toward a stretch of ancient farmland where the whole story of settled human life may have first taken shape. Tell me in the comments, which surprised you more, that Minoan and Mycenaean ancestry traces back overwhelmingly to Anatolia, or that modern Greeks still carry 70 to 80% of that same Bronze Age Mycenaean signature after 3,000 years of empires rising and falling on top of it.